This is Chapter 21, Grouping and Tracking by James A. Kulick, and my name is Brittany. So to start, grouping and tracking is controversial, it's confusing, and it's misunderstood. So hopefully after this presentation, you'll have a better idea about the differences between them and how they've progressed throughout the years. So are you a detracker? If you're a detracker, you want to rid schools of grouping and tracking. You view these two systems as a form of segregation. You hope for common curriculum for all students, and you'd overall like to eliminate the gifted and talented programs. So ability grouping and tracking are two different things, so I thought it would be important to get started by giving you proper definitions for both. So ability grouping is a characteristic of any program in which school personnel use test scores of school performance to assign same grade children to groups or classes with markedly different levels of academic preparation. So ability grouping covers within class and cross-grade grouping programs that were introduced during the 1940s and 50s. Tracking, on the other hand, we use the term to refer to high school programs in which students choose among college prep, general, or vocational classes on the basis of preparation and goals. And this definition is highlighted because this is the one that I'm going to go by. But it's also sometimes referred to as programs in which students are sorted at an early age by intelligence test scores into separate inflexible tracks for fast, medium, and slow learners where they remain through high school. So ability grouping and tracking is not curricular differentiation. That is a huge thing to note. Curricular differentiation is where all instructional programs that provide differentiated instruction for students. And so ability and grouping, that's not correct. It's not curricular differentiation. A differentiated curriculum provides different courses of study for same-age children with different learning needs and preferences. So an example of a curricular differentiated course would be like bilingual education or special education programs. So what do we see around the United States in terms of grouping and tracking? Well, almost all schools use some form of grouping for some classes. Most, if not all, children are grouped when it comes time for work, either in the classroom or in separate classrooms. So ability grouping based off of fast or slow learning students, it's most common in high school and least common in elementary school. So through history, we've seen a lot of different things happen. So beginning in the 1920s, grouping led to better school outcomes when ability groups worked with methods and materials that suited their aptitude levels. In the 1930s, a negative effect of grouping. This was where students learned less and also declined in self-concept and leadership skills in grouped classes. When the 1950s came around, this is when accelerated and enriched classes helped talented children academically and also seemed to have no detrimental effects on their social and emotional adjustment. And then in the 1960s, no one benefits from ability grouping, and that children who are in the middle and lower groups clearly suffer a loss of achievement, academic motivation, and self-esteem. So you can definitely see that through the years, opinions have changed, effects have changed, and conclusions have changed. So how do we interpret these results from all these different years? It's kind of confusing after reading all these. You're like, is grouping seen as a positive thing or a negative thing? Tracking, is it positive or negative? So in order to interpret the results that all these years have given us, we must distinguish carefully among the types of evaluation studies and types of programs that have gone on to be able to differentiate the results that come from grouping and tracking research. So there are types of evaluation studies. So experimental studies are studies that examine educational outcomes for equivalent students assigned to grouped and non-grouped classes. Ethnographic studies provide narrative descriptions of classroom processes in upper and lower tracks, and correlational analyses examine performance differences in upper and lower tracks when characteristics of students selecting the tracks are statistically controlled. So these are the different types of evaluation studies that I'm going to go through and talk about, and if you want a lot more details and further examples, you can find those in the article. So to start, experimental studies of grouping. This part in the article was separated into different types of grouping, so I kind of highlighted these so you could understand the differences. So XYZ grouping is where students were tested and placed into 3 different groups to go to different classes. So for example, you'd have a certain percentage of students go to X group, Y group, and Z group based off of where their test scores fell. Standard materials and methods were used in all the classes, and all classes covered material at the same grade level. So overall, this was shown given a weak evaluation record, and there was no curricula differentiation in XYZ grouping. Next, there was cross-grade grouping, which provided different curricula for children at different ability levels. Example of this is the Joplin plan, which required students in grades 4 to 6 to break into 9 different groups for reading. So they went to their assigned reading classes based off of all different reading levels, and then they returned to their normal class at the end of the 1 hour of reading that they had during the day. So the effects for the Joplin plan were positive for high, middle, and low groups. So another experimental study of grouping was the within-class grouping, and this provided different curricula for children at different ability levels and can raise class achievement in arithmetic, and that it may have dramatic effects on the performance of lower students. So when we're talking about advanced and accelerated classes for the gifted and talented, the basic idea is to modify a school program so that students complete standard courses at an earlier age or in less time than usual. So these classes show strong effects, most likely due to the curricular differentiation that we see in these classes. And finally, enriched classes for the gifted and talented, different than advanced and accelerated classes in that students spend about half the time working on curriculum and then the other half of the day pursuing enriching activities. So this could be anything from languages or types of art or a bunch of different examples where they're really digging into something a little different than their regular curriculum. And results show that in these classes, those students outperform students in mixed classes when they were given these enrichment classes. So the next type of study that we're going to look at is correlational analysis of tracking. So the correlational analysis addresses 2 main questions. So first, what factors influence students to enroll in these different curricular tracks? And when I say curricular tracks, I mean if they were to put themselves in college prep curriculum. And the other question was, how much do curricular tracks influence students? So when we go back to question 1, the answer to what factors influence students could be personal preference, what they would like to be in, academic ability. And so those 2 have the biggest track placement influences, and then some that have barely any influence would be personal preference is one of the main ones, but social class and race are some of the smaller roles in track placement. And then so when we talk about how much do curricular tracks influence students, this is one of those questions that is also answered with correlational analysis. But the problem with correlational analysis is that there are many problems, and so there's failure to measure all differences between the high and low tracks. There's failure to accurately measure all the control factors, such as the ones that we talked about when addressing question 1, and this makes conclusions undependable because the analysis is inadequate. So even though there is correlational analysis, we're not really sure that we can depend on this because we can't track all the different factors that are going into what are influencing students to enroll in these and how much are they being influenced by these curricular tracks. So finally, the ethnographic studies of tracking. Jeannie Oakes is one that they talked a lot about in this article, and so she talks about how there's more time to spend on instruction and less time was spent off task in these high tracks. So in higher tracks, there's more instruction and less time where students were spent off task. There are curricular differences in high and low track classes, which is understandable, and high track teachers seem to encourage competent and autonomous thinking compared to low track teachers who stressed low level skills and conformity to rules and expectations. So this is what she found through her ethnographic study of tracking. Continued, there are 2 other researchers who found 4 main conclusions of their ethnographic studies, although it's important to note that these are small findings. So first off, instruction is conceptually simplified and proceeds slower in lower tracks. Teachers with more experience and those deemed more successful seem to disproportionately be assigned to the higher tracks of teaching. Teachers view high track students positively and low track students negatively, and they also found that most of a student's friends are found in the same track. So what are some important things to note? So ethnographic analyses do not disentangle the effects due to grouping and due to student characteristics while also misinterpreting observations. It's also important to note that untracking when it's talked about, is a complicated and difficult business. It's a goal that is often desired but rarely achieved. So people are hoping for untracking, but in the end, they really can never reach that. But in some cases, when untracking is achieved, it brings no guarantee of high quality instruction for everyone, but instead may bring a low level equality to all. So those are important points to note. So in conclusion, there are a variety of grouping and tracking studies. To understand them, they must be summarized and organized. So we can't just look at all of them in a big group. We need to look at them individually, what kind of study they were, and then organize the information we're presented. So overall, ethnographic studies of grouping appear to be higher in rhetorical than scientific value. Findings from correlational analyses are also uncertain, and overall experimental studies still seem to be the best guide to understanding the effects of grouping on children. So after this, and maybe looking at the article a little bit, some discussion questions to think about are: it's time to take a side in the tracking wars. So would you be on the side of pro-tracking, or are you a detracker? And explain that for me. And then based on Kulik's article and your own feelings, what do you conclude about the virtues of tracking and ability grouping? So and I want to know, especially in regard to gifted students, what do you think about the virtues of tracking and ability grouping? So answer those two questions for me and I'll respond back. Thanks for listening.